Welcome to this relatively brief presentation on basics on the formation of the Pentateuch. The aim of this presentation is to supplement my more detailed discussion of the formation of the Pentateuch in my textbook, The Hebrew Bible, a Contemporary Introduction, published by Wiley. And I'll be trying to talk about areas of both consensus and disagreement among scholars on the formation of the Pentateuch. Let's go on to my more specific aims. The plan is, first of all, to give you a visualization of the Pentateuch's complexity and talk about what most scholars agree on about the formation of the Pentateuch Torah. This is important because as you read this material, you can sometimes conclude that almost nothing is agreed on. And I think it's important to recognize that actually there's a remarkable amount of agreement among scholars on some crucial issues about the formation of the Pentateuch or Torah. But then I want to talk about the chief area in which scholars continue to disagree, and disagree in important ways, on the early formation of the Pentateuch Torah, especially about the formation of what many scholars refer to as the non-priestly or pre-priestly material. And then I'll conclude by talking about why all this agreement or disagreement might matter in interpretation of the texts. First of all, I want to just say that most scholars agree that the Pentateuch was formed over time. And in that respect, it resembles the ancient tell that is depicted here from Bet Shean, which contains the remains of 6,000 years of successive cities built from the Neolithic or Chalcolithic periods to the medieval periods, built one on top of the other of the ruins of another city, so that you now have a hilltop made up of these successive cities. And archaeologists then can excavate working downward from the most recent layers of the city to older layers, which are only partially preserved. And this can be an image, it's imperfect, of how the Pentateuch as well is formed of the successive layers of textual remains from the scribes of ancient Israel. So let me talk about areas of consensus that scholars have reached, especially on the later layers of that Pentateuchal tell. First of all, for almost 200 years or 150 years, depending on how you count, scholars have agreed on the basic distinction of a priestly layer, often termed P, in the Pentateuch, from everything else in the Pentateuch, which could be referred to as non-P, or I'll suggest another term that's useful at least for the later layers of the non-priestly material. Scholars also have agreed for over a century on the distinction of the Book of Deuteronomy, often referred to as D, from the other non-priestly material that's found in the books of Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers. The book of Leviticus is made up of priestly material exclusively. And then finally, scholars generally agree that the originally separate P and non-P strands of the Pentateuch were combined to make our present Pentateuch at a relatively late date, post-exilic or Persian period, if those terms make sense to you. And the image for that combining of these P and non-P strands that I suggest is interweaving, as suggested in the braided strands that you see on the upper right-hand corner. This is a pretty remarkable form of textual growth, taking two originally separate strands that parallel each other and telling similar stories, and combining them into a new whole. It's not common in the ancient world, but it seems to have happened in the case of our Pentateuch. So if we're trying to imagine the layer upon layer of the agreed upon material portions of the history of the formation of the Pentateuch, starting from the top, there's the combination of P and non-P strands in the post-exilic period into our combined Pentateuch. Going earlier into the exile, there's the creation of the priestly document as a late exilic text that's distinct from both the D Book of Deuteronomy and other non-P texts. And then there's the question of what about the earlier history of non-P materials? And that's where you see lots of question marks. In some, there's an agreement among scholars on three blocks of material that preceded our Pentateuch: the priestly document P, Deuteronomy D, and earlier non-P material, as well as some scholars thinking there's a late non-P material as well. But I'll focus for now on the pre-P material. This initial consensus already explains a lot in our Pentateuch, such as the two creation narratives found at the outset of Genesis, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 to 3. It explains doublets between the P flood strand and non-P flood strand in Genesis and various other features of that flood story. It explains two covenants that we find in Genesis 15 and 17 that God makes with Abraham that cover similar material and various other problems in the Abraham story. And it also explains many other elements found in the Pentateuch, such as the two calls of Moses, or doublets in the story of the Red Sea deliverance of Israel, or also numerous disagreements that we find between laws on similar topics in the book of Exodus, which contains, along with priestly material, a non-priestly legal collection, and then Leviticus, which contains priestly legislation, and then the book of Deuteronomy that has Deuteronomic law. Sometimes all three of these blocks have laws on similar topics, and they disagree with each other, and that goes back to the fact that they originated in separate blocks of text. So what about the disagreements, question marks? As mentioned before, these disagreements among scholars focus particularly on different models that scholars have for the earliest formation of the Pentateuch, that is, the formation of the pre-priestly or early non-priestly material in the Pentateuch. So let me talk about two major models for that. To summarize, there is an older model, the documentary approach. This is the one that some students have learned in other contexts with documents, not just D and P, which I've already talked about, but J and E as well. So J, E, D, and P. And this older documentary approach posits that the earliest history of the pre-P material constituted the creation of two longer sources in the early pre-exilic period, a J source in the south and an E source in the north. And there are some scholars who still believe in this approach, and you'll find it in many textbooks, so I'll cover it briefly in this presentation. But the main focus of this presentation will be on what will be termed here the sources and supplements approach. Other scholars will use other terms, such as the tradition historical approach. And in this approach, those older sources, J and E, don't seem to exist. Many scholars doubt they ever did. And so I'll talk about what they do think existed in the early history of the Pentateuch. And then again, I want to talk about how these approaches come at the Abraham story differently, especially the promise that God offers to Abraham at the outset of the Abraham story, and really make a difference in how we interpret that text. So let me start with the sources and supplements model. And I do this because this corresponds to what is the primary model advocated in the textbook. And because I find that the simplicity of the older documentary approach can sometimes just be so easy to understand for many students that they just sort of stick with that. So I'm going to start with the sources and supplements model. And according to that model, the early history of the pre-P tradition starts actually with originally separate compositions that covered different episodes in the history of early Israel, such as an early northern Jacob story that was not just oral, but actually written down. And possibly an early Joseph story or novella that likewise was written down. You see question marks here because some of my colleagues in the field would particularly doubt whether the Joseph material is early. I think it is. An early version of the Moses Exodus story, again, there are very early oral traditions likely connected with the Exodus, but I'm suggesting that behind our book of Exodus is an early version, early written story concerning Moses and the Exodus. And then also traditions formed in Judah of the south, with Jerusalem as its capital. And the best candidate for that is the non-priestly primeval narrative found in parts of Genesis 2 through 11. And there may also have been certain oral or maybe written versions of the Abraham story, such as the Abraham-Lot cycle that we find in chapter 13 and 18 to 19 of Genesis, or the Elohistic stories of Abraham found behind the chapters 20 to possibly 22 of Genesis. There are certain parallels between these blocks that suggest some sort of separate origin, whether oral or written. So according to the sources and supplements model, these sources, many of them written, some of them oral, form the building blocks for what becomes our sort of pre-priestly Pentateuch. I notice here I'm doing this in one take, so I have a couple of other blocks to mention in the Abraham story, such as different stories about Hagar in 16 and Abraham, Sarah in 12. That also may have been part of those building blocks that lead to our pre-priestly Pentateuch. So far, I've been talking about the building blocks, the sources of the pre-Pentateuch and these compositions, but it's really knit together by a series of supplements. And these supplements create a broader Torah amidst imperial trauma. And that's what I'm trying to image through this picture by Moore of Jerusalem burning. It's actually Jerusalem of a later period, but I think it vividly illustrates the type of trauma that was faced by the Judean scribes, likely, who knit together these different sources, building blocks, into a larger story about Israel's pre-land existence. So this starts, of course, with those scribes having those early sources, those building blocks that I've just discussed. But what they do is they add different layers of material to knit this together into a larger story, so that no longer do you have a separate primeval narrative that concludes with Noah and his sons, or a separate Jacob story, or separate Moses Exodus story, but at various points, these different building blocks are connected by scholars, by scribes working in later periods of Judean history when they faced and were contending with the memory of Assyrian trauma, and then especially Babylonian trauma amidst the Babylonian exile. And these layers of connective tissue, these materials often focus on a promise to a desperate and despairing people experiencing these traumas, and sort of promise by way of stories about these patriarchs a better future to the audiences of these later scribes. And so the material that's identified in green are the supplements of the sources and supplements approach, which helped put together our longer pre-P Pentateuchal compositions. The image I find helpful for visualizing this kind of process, in contrast to the interweaving that was characteristic of P and non-P, comes from this quilt done by Anna Mae Young in her work clothes quilt with center medallion of strips composition, part of a G's Bend collection of quilts out of the Southern African American tradition. This quilt is working with building blocks, the strips of cloth taken from earlier garments or various kinds of textiles, but they're now knit together, connected together by the connective tissue of the threads that make up the quilt. Those would be those green L layers. And so this sort of quilting is what I'm suggesting took place amidst situations of trauma, both in the wake of Assyrian trauma and then also in the midst of Babylonian exile. So some examples of what this connecting did. And let me just explain the terminology I use again. I find the term L useful for describing this connective tissue because it describes how these connective tissue layers of promise and blessing are later than the earlier building block compositions that they're inserted into. They're likely done by lay scribes as opposed to the priestly scribes who put together the priestly document. And they are layers, multiple layers of connective tissue, linking components of the Pentateuch to each other. And one of the best examples of this is the promise to Abraham that starts in Genesis 12, 1, 2 to 3. As I quote it here, I'll make you a great nation, bless you, and make your name great, and be a blessing. And I'll bless those who bless you and curse anyone who treats you lightly. And the way I translate the next verse is, and all clans of the ground will bless themselves by you. That is, you, Abraham, will be such an example of blessing that people will wish on themselves a blessing like the one you experienced. This crucial promise, which we see echoes of in other texts that I'll discuss in a second, really provides the crucial connective tissue that links the primeval history with the stories of Abraham. And so it sort of is a bridge text that then gets echoed to also link to the Jacob and Joseph and Moses Exodus stories eventually, in sort of connecting and making a longer document out of originally separate stories about creation, flood, on the one hand, and then ancestors of Israel, such as Jacob, Joseph, and Moses on the other. The various authors who added these later layers, this set of L additions, also systematically reframe early Abraham's traditions, some of which I outlined in earlier slides, like the Elohistic traditions found in Genesis 20 to 22, and also the Lot traditions and Hagar and so on, in light of that earlier promise. So the Abraham story we now have is saturated with themes from this L promise of blessing to people who are experiencing trauma. And then as we progress later in the book of Genesis and then into Exodus, we can see the relatively clear addition of this L theme of promise and blessing to earlier written traditions that lacked it. And I provide an example in the textbook of how we might be seeing that in the story of Jacob at Bethel in Genesis 28. But there are many other examples I could cover with more time. One image that I found helpful, again, to visualize what's happened in terms of this connecting of earlier sources, these building blocks, through this L connective tissue, is this conglomerate rock, where we can see larger chunks of rock that have been connected through the cement of later sand and other substances. So say one of these larger chunks might be the J or non-P primeval history. Another might be the different Abraham traditions around Hagar and Lot and Abraham's stay in Gerar and so on, oral or written as they might have been. And another might have been separate Jacob and Joseph compositions that are then combined with each other. And these blocks, along with others, such as the Exodus Moses story, are then connected into a larger pre-P Pentateuchal composition, maybe preliminarily a pre-P Proto-Genesis composition and Exodus composition. It's hard to know, but they're gradually combined through different later layers of lay scribes, creation of Torah refracted stories of Israel's landless ancestors. So here you can see me flipping back and forth as I, again, in one take, do this presentation. But the main idea here is the formation of the Pentateuch amidst different situations of trauma. Let me now talk about a very different model that posits a different setting for the formation of the Pentateuch's earliest traditions. This is the documentary hypothesis. It's an older hypothesis developed in the later 1800s, but it's continued across the 20th century and the 1900s, and it's still advocated and renewed and revised by some scholars today. This posits that the Pentateuch actually started with a very extended sort of proto-Pentateuch already in the 10th or 9th century, in the time of Solomon, maybe the early kings of Israel. And this early 10th, 9th century document is often referred to as J, which is reflecting the German pronunciation of the divine name, Yahweh or Yahweh. It comes up as Yahweh in terms of terming the document. And this was created in Judah with its capital in Jerusalem under the Davidic monarchy. And then sometime in the 9th or 8th century, according to the documentary hypothesis, we see the creation of another extended proto-Pentateuchal document, the Elohist, which is created in the northern kingdom of Israel. And this starts with Abraham traditions, particularly in chapters 20 to 22, and then continues with select traditions, which are assigned to the Elohist in the Jacob and Joseph stories and the Moses Exodus stories. And then according to the documentary hypothesis, these two are combined sometime, much like P and non-P are later on, and interwoven with each other into a JE or Yehuvistic document. Now, I put question marks next to this particular stage because some of the major advocates of this theory in contemporary times, the neo-documentarians, do not actually even agree that this interweaving already took place separately from the interweaving of J and D and non-P. They posit they all happened at the same time. But according to the traditional form of the documentary hypothesis, there's an initial stage of interweaving that happens of J and E before they are later then combined with D and with P. So again, for the documentary hypothesis, the primary model across the whole history of the Pentateuch is of interweaving of originally separate strands that are parallel to each other. They cover lots of different episodes about Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses and the Israelites in the Exodus. They all cover that, but they cover it in different ways and then are later interwoven with each other. Now, there are some issues for the documentary hypothesis that have been raised over the last decades, and I'll just briefly summarize them here. First of all, there's a striking lack of links between subparts of the Pentateuch when you really look at it. The primeval history almost never refers to anything recognizable about the ancestors, and as we sort of direct our gaze to parts of the Jacob, Joseph, Moses, and Israelite stories, they also lack many links to the primeval history on the one hand, or to each other. And many of the links that we do find, like the promise text I just talked about in Genesis 12, or especially the promise text that we find in, say, the Bethel story about Jacob in Genesis 28, or other parts of the Jacob and Joseph stories in the latter half of Genesis, seem to have been secondarily added to their context. They don't seem original to it. And as such, they seem to be more later L-connective tissue additions as opposed to original parts of the compositions they now appear in. In addition, the assumption of extended pre-exilic sources, J and or E's, existing across the Pentateuch conflicts with the fact that our datable pre-exilic texts, such as the early material from Isaiah or Micah or Amos or various other sources, actually lack mention of the distinctive themes that actually link diverse parts of the Pentateuch, like the promise to Abraham and other ancestors. We first see appearance of those themes in clearly datable texts in the late pre-exilic period, and especially then in the exile. And that suggests that actually, those sort of crucial linking texts weren't created until periods of trauma or early Israel. Also, the traditional documentary hypothesis posits that the earliest origins of the Pentateuch were in a J document created in the South, but our indicators of earliest origins of the Pentateuch actually appear in the North, not the South. Our first datable mention of Pentateuch-like traditions occurs in the prophet Hosea, who's a northern prophet. And when we take a look at the place names that are foregrounded in early materials about Jacob, such as Bethel, they happen to be capitals of northern cities, not Jerusalem. Jerusalem, in fact, is hardly mentioned anywhere in the Pentateuch. So these kinds of data suggest that there isn't some early J document created in Jerusalem that later, an Elohistic document created in the North parallels. Instead, our earliest sources of the Pentateuch probably were in the North, with the possible exception of the primeval history, which has various potential connections to Jerusalem. Finally, and this is something you only see when you work through the history of scholarship on the documentary hypothesis. Now looking back on 100 years plus of scholars working with that hypothesis, they've really had a particular challenge achieving any agreement on which text can be assigned to J and which text to E. And this contrasts with the relative consensus that scholars have achieved in distinguishing P and non-P materials from each other. So this lack of consensus on what is in J and E is another thing that weakens that one component of the documentary hypothesis that focuses on J and E. Let me conclude by talking about how a decision on which model you're working with here actually would matter for interpreting texts in the Pentateuch. The documentary hypothesis that I've just been talking about posits that J and then E sources were created separately in the early Judean and Israelite kingdoms, sort of in a pre-trauma phase of Israel's history, so that God's promises of blessing, protection, and nationhood that we see in Genesis 12, 2-3, are understood to be a reinforcement of existing political power structures. That's how you would read that text if you're working with the documentary hypothesis. If we're looking at the sources and supplements hypothesis in contrast, yes, we have older compositions that I've discussed already that are created in this somewhat pre-trauma period, such as a Jacob composition written down, or an early J or non-P primeval history that likewise was written down and covered stories of creation and origins, possibly a Moses Exodus story that's likewise written down. But those traditions aren't eventually linked together through the theme of promise and blessing into a longer document until periods of Israelite trauma, whether in the wake of Assyrian imperialism or during Israel's ultimate trauma, which was the Babylonian exile and destruction of Jerusalem. So if we read crucial linking texts such as Genesis 12 in light of that kind of historical setting, it appears differently. It's not reinforcing an existing political power structure. Instead, it's speaking to a people in diaspora who have experienced the trauma of the loss of what they thought was their invulnerable city and are now facing possible extinction, living as a marginalized minority in the midst of a foreign country. And seen in this context, the promise seen in Genesis 12, 2-3 of protection, blessing, and neighborhood would be a L-layer linking text designed to reassure traumatized Judeans who are facing that kind of Assyrian or especially Babylonian oppression. So this one text, the very same text, appears differently if it's understood to reinforce a political structure under, say, Solomon, versus to reassure and provide hope to a traumatized diaspora people in Babylonian exile or in the wake of Assyrian trauma. So where to go from here? I just would emphasize that we don't actually have any actual copies of any of these pre-sources. We're simply working with clues in the text. So neither model can be decided on based on the manuscripts. They just represent some very different ways of conceptualizing the early history of the formation of the Pentateuch. And of course, we can't decide between these models based on which interpretation of the text we like better. Instead, scholars try to work with the other kinds of indicators that I summarized to decide between, say, the older documentary approach or the newer sources and supplements approach for the earliest history of the Pentateuch. And so that's why I'm taking time in this presentation to summarize those different kinds of data that we have and to try to suggest different ways we might work with that data to decide on which model is more plausible, and then try to decide what that then tells us about interpreting the biblical text. I hope this has been helpful, and you can go back then to the chapter and supplement that material with the visualizations and information in this presentation.